When Civil War veteran Jacob Brennan discovers a brutally beaten woman collapsed near his isolated Arizona Canyon home, he expects nothing more than to nurse her back to health before sending her on her way. But as Elena's mysterious past catches up with them and her violent husband closes in, Jacob must decide whether opening his guarded heart is worth risking everything he's built in his carefully constructed solitude. Will love be enough to heal two broken souls, or will it destroy them both? The shotgun blast echoed through Red Canyon like thunder, sending a family of jackrabbits scattering into the brush. Jacob Brennan lowered his weapon and watched the rattlesnake's headless body writhe in the dust beside his cabin door. Death had a way of finding him, even here in the middle of nowhere. Arizona territory stretched endlessly in every direction from his small wooden home. The year was 1867, and most folks were still picking up the pieces from the war that had torn the country apart. Jacob preferred the company of lizards and coyotes to people these days. People asked too many questions about scars that ran deeper than skin. He kicked the snake's body away from his porch and wiped sweat from his forehead. The November sun still burned hot during the day, though nights brought a chill that cut through his worn cotton shirts. His horse, Belle, nickered from the small corral he'd built between two towering red rocks. "I know, girl," he said, walking over to scratch behind her ears. "Time for water." Jacob had chosen this spot for good reasons. Hidden in a narrow canyon 20 miles from the nearest town, it offered protection from both desert storms and unwanted visitors. A natural spring bubbled up from between the rocks, providing fresh water year-round. The cliff walls blocked the worst of the wind, and caves in the rock face gave him extra storage space. But the best thing about this place was the silence. He'd been a captain in the Union Army, leading men through battles that turned boys into ghosts. The sounds of war still visited him in dreams: cannon fire, screaming horses, soldiers calling for their mothers. Out here, the only sounds were whined through stone and the occasional call of a desert hawk. Jacob filled Belle's water trough and checked her feed. The mare had been with him since the war ended 2 years ago. She was getting gray around the muzzle, but she still had good years left. Unlike some of the men he'd served with, Belle had made it through without losing pieces of herself. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like an empty page. He had firewood to split, a broken fence rail to fix, and jerky to cut from the deer he'd shot yesterday. Simple work that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He was reaching for his axe when Belle's ears pricked forward. She stared toward the main trail that wound through the canyon, her body tense. Jacob followed her gaze, but saw nothing except heat waves dancing above the red dirt. Then he heard it, the faint sound of hoofbeats, still far off but getting closer. Jacob's hand moved automatically to the Colt revolver on his hip. Visitors were rare out here, and in his experience, people who traveled alone through the desert usually had good reasons for avoiding towns. He stepped into the shadow of his porch and waited. The rider appeared around a bend in the canyon wall, a man on a dark horse, moving fast, too fast for the rocky terrain. As the stranger got closer, Jacob could see he was young, maybe 20, with a soft look of someone who'd never missed many meals. The rider pulled up short when he spotted Jacob's cabin. His horse danced nervously, foam on its mouth from being pushed too hard in the heat. "You there?" the young man called out. "Have you seen a woman come through here? Dark hair, about this tall?" He held his hand up to show height. Jacob stayed in the shadows of his porch. "Depends on who's asking." "Name's Billy Reeves. I'm looking for my sister. She's been missing for 3 days now." Something in the young man's voice didn't sit right with Jacob. He'd heard enough lies during the war to recognize when someone wasn't telling the truth. "Lot of trails through these canyons," Jacob said carefully. "Woman on foot wouldn't get far in this country." Billy's horse pranced sideways, and Jacob noticed the animal's flanks were marked with spur cuts. A man who treated his horse that way probably treated people worse. "She might not be alone," Billy said, his voice getting harder. "Could be someone helped her. Someone might be hiding her." Now Jacob was certain this wasn't about a missing sister. The way Billy's hand rested near his gun, the way his eyes scanned Jacob's property like he was planning something, this was trouble looking for a place to happen. Haven't seen any women, Jacob said, but I'll keep an eye out. Billy stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, he wheeled his horse around. If you do see her, there's money in it for you, he called over his shoulder. Good money for someone who knows how to keep his mouth shut. Jacob watched until Billy disappeared around the canyon bend. Then he walked to his rifle rack inside the cabin and took down his Winchester. Something was wrong about that whole conversation, and in the desert, wrong usually meant dangerous. He spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning his weapons and checking his ammunition. When darkness fell, he banked his fire low and positioned himself where he could watch both approaches to his canyon. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by dreams of war and the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, trouble was heading his way. The scream that woke Jacob before dawn wasn't human, at least not entirely. It sounded like a wounded animal mixed with something far worse. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto his porch, searching the gray pre-dawn light for movement. Belle whinnied nervously from her corral, ears flat against her head. Whatever had made that sound was close enough to spook his horse, but Jacob couldn't see anything in the dim light. Then he heard it again, weaker this time, coming from the direction of Willow Creek about a quarter-mile down the canyon. Not an animal after all. Someone was hurt, and hurt bad. Jacob pulled on his boots and hat, then started down the narrow path that led to the creek. The sound came again, definitely human now, definitely female. He moved carefully, rifle ready, eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of ambush. He found her crumpled beside a fallen cottonwood tree, half hidden in the tall grass near the water's edge. At first glance, she looked like a broken doll someone had thrown away. Her dress was torn and stained with blood and dirt. Dark bruises covered her face and arms like storm clouds. But she was breathing. Jacob knelt beside her, keeping his rifle within easy reach. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 25, with long black hair that had probably been beautiful before it became matted with blood and desert dust. "Miss?" he said quietly. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dark brown eyes filled with pain and something else. Fear. When she saw him, she tried to crawl backward despite her obvious injuries. "No," she whispered. "Please, no more." "Easy now," Jacob said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Jacob. What's yours?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "Elena," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Elena's a pretty name." Jacob kept his voice gentle, the same tone he'd used with wounded soldiers during the war. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" She shook her head quickly, then winced as the movement caused her pain. "Can't. They'll find me." Jacob looked around the canyon walls. Whoever had done this to her might still be out there, which meant they were both in danger. "Elena, I need to get you somewhere safe. Can you walk?" She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. Jacob could see her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, broken, probably. Her ribs might be cracked too, judging by how carefully she was breathing. "I'm going to carry you to my cabin," he said. "It's not far." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Jacob thought about that for a moment. Why was he helping her? The smart thing would be to ride to town and get the sheriff. Let someone else deal with whatever trouble this woman had brought to his canyon. But looking at her battered face, he remembered other faces from the war. Civilians caught in the fighting, people who'd suffered because they were in the wrong place when bad men decided to do bad things. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Most people wouldn't think so. Jacob slipped his arms under her as gently as possible. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably hadn't eaten much in recent days. As he lifted her, she made a small sound of pain but didn't protest. The walk back to his cabin took twice as long as usual. Jacob had to stop several times to rest and to make sure Elena hadn't fainted. By the time they reached his porch, the sun was fully up and the canyon was filled with golden light. Inside, Jacob cleared his table and helped Elena lie down on the rough wooden surface. In better light, her injuries looked even worse. Besides the broken arm and possible broken ribs, She had cuts on her face and hands, bruises everywhere, and what looked like rope burns on her wrists. "Who did this to you?" Jacob asked as he gathered clean cloth for bandages. Elena turned her face away. "It doesn't matter now. It matters to me, and it'll matter to whoever comes looking for you." She was quiet, while Jacob cleaned the worst of her cuts. His hands were gentle but sure. He'd patched up plenty of wounded soldiers, and knew how to work without causing unnecessary pain. "There was a young man here yesterday," Jacob said as he worked. "Said he was looking for his sister. Dark hair, about your height." Elena's whole body went rigid. "Billy? That's what he called himself. I don't think he was really looking for a sister, though." Tears started flowing down Elena's cheeks. "He found me. They all found me." "They?" "Billy works for the man I ran away from. There are others. They won't give up until they drag me back." Jacob finished bandaging her arm and stepped back. "Elena, I need you to tell me exactly what we're dealing with here. If there are men coming after you, I need to know how many and what they're capable of." She looked at him with those dark, frightened eyes. "You should take me to town and let the sheriff handle it. I won't have your death on my conscience, too." "Too late for that," Jacob said. "The moment I carried you into this cabin, I made a choice. Now, who are we up against?" Elena closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. When she opened them again, Jacob saw something new there. Not just fear, but determination. "His name is Marcus Delacroix," she said, "and he doesn't believe in letting go of what he thinks belongs to him." Elena's fever broke on the third night, but not before she'd spoken names in her delirium that made Jacob's blood run cold. Marcus, Billy, the Delacroix brothers. Each name came with fragments of memories, wedding bells that sounded like funeral dirges, fists that fell like hammers, and a house that had become a prison. Jacob sat beside her makeshift bed, a damp cloth in his hand, watching her face relax as the fever finally released its grip. For 3 days, he'd barely slept, changing her bandages, spooning broth between her cracked lips, and listening to her fevered confessions about a life that had been stolen piece by piece. "Water," Elena whispered, her first clear word in days. Jacob helped her sit up, supporting her back as she drank slowly from his tin cup. Color was returning to her cheeks, and her eyes were focused instead of wild with fever. "How long?" she asked. 3 days. You had me worried there for a while." Elena looked around his small cabin as if seeing it for the first time. Jacob had built everything himself: the rough wooden table, the stone fireplace, the shelves that held his few possessions. It wasn't much, but it was clean and warm and safe. "I remember falling," she said slowly, "by the creek, and then you carried me. Your arm's broken, and you've got some cracked ribs, but you're alive." She touched the splint he'd fashioned for her arm, testing its tightness. "You know about doctoring?" "Learned during the war. Had to patch up a lot of soldiers who were hurt worse than you." Elena studied his face, taking in the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his hands moved with practiced confidence. "You were an officer." It wasn't a question. Jacob had noticed that about her, she saw things other people missed. "Captain," he admitted. "Didn't much like giving orders, but someone had to. And now you live alone in the middle of nowhere." Jacob poured himself coffee from the pot that had been brewing on his fire. The morning sun was streaming through his single window, painting everything golden. "Suits me fine. Until now." He looked at her over his cup. "Until now." Elena struggled to stand, Jacob moving quickly to steady her. She was stronger than she looked, but the beating had taken its toll. Every movement caused her to wince, though she tried to hide it. "I need to leave," she said. "Today. You can barely stand." "I can ride. Get me a horse and I'll be gone before noon." Jacob set down his coffee. "Elena, you're in no condition to travel. And even if you were, where would you go?" "Anywhere but here. Marcus will come looking. And when he does..." She trailed off, but Jacob could fill in the rest. "Let him come." The words surprised them both. Jacob hadn't planned to say them, but now that they were out, he realized he meant them. "You don't understand," Elena said. Marcus Delacroix isn't just any man. He owns half the cattle ranches between here and New Mexico. He's got money, connections, and men who do whatever he tells them to do. And I'm just one man with a rifle. Exactly. Jacob walked to his window and looked out at the canyon walls that surrounded his little sanctuary. For 2 years, these red rocks had been his fortress against the world. Now they might become a battleground. Tell me about him, Jacob said without turning around. Elena was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was 17 when I married him. My father owed Marcus money, gambling debts that kept growing no matter how much he paid. Marcus said he'd forgive everything if I became his wife. Jacob's hands tightened on the window frame. At first he was charming, brought me flowers, took me to fancy dinners in Santa Fe. I thought I was lucky. Elena's laugh was bitter. The first time he hit me was on our wedding night. I'd spilled wine on his shirt by accident. How long were you married? 8 years. 8 years of walking on eggshells, of hiding bruises, of pretending everything was perfect when we went to church or social gatherings. Jacob turned to face her. What changed? What made you finally leave? Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. For just a moment, her face showed a different kind of pain, not physical, but something deeper. I was pregnant, she said quietly. For the first time in 8 years, I was carrying a child. And Marcus, when he found out, he said things. Terrible things about what he'd do if the baby wasn't born perfect, if it cried too much, if it got in his way. Jacob felt something cold settle in his chest. I lost the baby 2 weeks later. The doctor said it was natural, that these things happen. But I knew. I knew it was because of the stress, the fear, the way I had to live in that house. I'm sorry. That night, after the funeral, Marcus came home drunk. He said it was probably for the best, that I wasn't fit to be a mother anyway. That's when I knew I had to leave or he'd kill me. Elena walked slowly to Jacob's fireplace, staring into the flames. I took what little money I could find and ran, made it almost to the Mexican border before Billy caught up with me. Billy's not really your brother. Billy's one of Marcus's ranch hands. Young, stupid, and desperate to prove himself. Marcus sent him to bring me back. Jacob processed this information, already planning defenses and escape routes. How many men does Marcus have? Enough. And they're not all stupid like Billy. Outside, Belle whinnied nervously. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. A lone rider was approaching from the south. Not Billy this time, but someone older, more careful in how he approached. Stay back from the windows, Jacob told Elena. The rider stopped just outside rifle range and called out, Jacob Brennan, I'm Sheriff Tom Morrison from Copper Ridge. I'd like to have a word with you. Sheriff Morrison sat his horse like a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than most people spent in their own beds. His silver mustache and weathered face spoke of 30 years keeping peace in a land where peace was always temporary. Jacob stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready. Sheriff, you're a long way from town. Been tracking some trouble that seems to have wandered into your canyon. Morrison's eyes took in every detail of Jacob's property. The defensive positions, the sight lines, the places where a man might take cover. What kind of trouble? The kind that involves a missing woman and some very angry men with deep pockets. Morrison dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. Mind if I come up and talk? Jacob glanced back at his cabin door. Elena was listening from inside, probably fighting the urge to run despite her injuries. Depends on what you want to talk about. Morrison walked closer, and Jacob could see the man's badge pinned to his vest. But more importantly, he could see the careful way the sheriff moved, the respect he showed for the situation. Marcus Delacroix filed a complaint in my office yesterday, Morrison said. Claims his wife stole money from him and ran off with another man. Says she's dangerous and needs to be brought back for her own safety. And you believe him? Morrison's laugh was dry as desert wind. Son, I've been sheriff for longer than you've been alive. I know the difference between a concerned husband and a man who beats his wife. The words hung in the air between them. Jacob felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. But, Morrison continued. I also know the difference between a man minding his own business and a man harboring a fugitive. Which one are you, Mr. Brennan? Before Jacob could answer, Elena stepped out of the cabin. She moved carefully, one hand pressed to her ribs, but her chin was raised with dignity. Sheriff Morrison, she said, I remember you from church in Copper Ridge. Morrison's face softened when he saw her injuries. Mrs. Delacroix, your husband's been looking for you. I'm sure he has. He's offering a substantial reward for information about your whereabouts. Elena's smile was sharp as a knife blade. How much? $500. Jacob whistled low. That was more money than most men saw in 2 years. Generous, Elena said. But then Marcus always believed in paying well for what he wanted. Morrison studied her face, taking in the fading bruises, the way she held herself. Ma'am, I have to ask, did your husband do this to you? Which time? The simple question carried 8 years of pain. Morrison's jaw tightened. Mrs. Delacroix, if you're willing to testify about what happened, I can arrest him for assault. Elena shook her head. You can try, but Marcus has friends in high places, judges who owe him favors, politicians who need his support. I'd be dead before the trial ended. Then what do you want to do? Elena looked at Jacob, then back at the sheriff. I want to disappear. Find somewhere Marcus can't reach me and start over. That's not as easy as it sounds, Morrison said. Man like Delacroix has a long reach, and he's not the type to give up. I know. Morrison walked to his horse and pulled a folded paper from his saddlebags. This came by telegraph this morning. Thought you should see it. Elena unfolded the paper and read. Her face went pale. What is it? Jacob asked. Marcus is coming himself, with 6 of his men. Elena's voice was steady, but Jacob could see her hands shaking. They'll be here tomorrow. Morrison nodded grimly. That's what I figured, which is why I rode out to warn you. Warn us? Mr. Brennan, I've been watching you for 2 years. You pay your debts, you don't cause trouble, and you mind your own business. But I also know you served in the war, and I know you're not the type to back down from a fight. Jacob looked at Elena, then at the canyon walls that surrounded his home. What are you suggesting, Sheriff? I'm suggesting that if 7 men ride into this canyon tomorrow morning, they better be prepared for whatever welcome they receive. Elena stepped forward. Sheriff, I won't have Jacob's death on my conscience. If Marcus wants me back so badly, maybe I should just go with him. No? Jacob's voice was flat, final. Jacob. No. He turned to Morrison. Sheriff, what happens if Marcus Delacroix has an accident out here in the desert? Say his horse throws him or he gets bit by a rattlesnake. Morrison adjusted his hat, considering the question carefully. Well, I suppose that would be a terrible tragedy. Of course, I'd have to investigate any such accident thoroughly. But the desert's a dangerous place. Lots of ways a man can get hurt if he's not careful. The 3 of them stood in silence, understanding passing between them without words. There's something else, Morrison said finally. I did some checking on Marcus Delacroix. Turns out he's got warrants in 2 other territories, cattle rustling in Colorado, fraud in New Mexico. Been using his money and connections to stay ahead of the law. Elena's eyes widened. You could arrest him when he gets here. Could try. But like you said, he's got friends. Might not stick. Jacob checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. Then we make sure it doesn't come to that. Morrison climbed back onto his horse. I never had this conversation with either of you. But if I were you, I'd make sure I had plenty of ammunition and a good view of anyone approaching this canyon. As the sheriff rode away, Jacob and Elena stood watching until he disappeared around the bend. You don't have to do this, Elena said quietly. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her. Despite everything she'd been through, there was strength in her face, courage in the way she stood despite her pain. Yeah, he said, I do. Because somewhere in the past 4 days, between changing her bandages and listening to her fevered confessions, Jacob had realized something that surprised him. He wasn't just helping a stranger anymore. He was protecting someone who'd become important to him, someone worth fighting for. And tomorrow, Marcus Delacroix would learn what happened to men who hurt people Jacob cared about. The explosion that shattered the dawn silence sent rocks cascading down the canyon walls like deadly rain. Jacob threw himself over Elena, shielding her from the debris as his cabin windows burst inward in a shower of glass and splinters. "Dynamite!" he gasped, tasting dust and gunpowder. "They're not planning to take you back alive." Elena's face had gone white as chalk. Through the settling dust, they could see 7 riders spreading out across the canyon mouth, blocking every escape route. Marcus Delacroix sat his black stallion in the center, a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and cruelty. "Elena," Marcus's voice boomed off the red rock walls. "Come out now, and I might let your friend live." Jacob crawled to his rifle rack, glass crunching under his knees. His Winchester was undamaged, but 2 of his other guns had been destroyed by flying rocks. He checked his ammunition belt, 30 rounds. Against 7 men, it wouldn't be enough for a long fight. "He's bluffing," Elena whispered, though her voice shook. "Marcus doesn't make deals." "Then we make our own rules." Jacob moved to the back window, the one that faced the steep canyon wall. Years ago, he'd carved handholds into the rock face, an escape route he'd hoped never to use. Now it might be their only chance. "Can you climb with that broken arm?" Elena looked at the sheer cliff and swallowed hard. "I can try." Another voice called out from the canyon floor, younger, eager. "Marcus, let me flush them out. A few more sticks of dynamite ought to do it." "Patience, Billy. We do this right." Jacob recognized the voice of the young man who'd come looking for Elena days earlier. But Billy sounded different now, harder, more dangerous. Whatever Marcus had promised him had turned the boy into something else. "Elena, darling," Marcus called again, his voice like honey poured over broken glass. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble. Cost me time, money, and reputation. But I'm willing to forgive all that if you come home where you belong." Elena's hands clenched into fists. 8 years, she whispered. 8 years of his forgiveness. Jacob studied the riders through his scope. Marcus had positioned his men well, 3 on each side of the canyon, 1 watching the back trail. They knew what they were doing. This wasn't their first manhunt, but Jacob had advantages too. He knew every rock, every shadow, every defensive position in this canyon. And he'd learned something important during the war. Desperate men fought harder than confident ones. "Listen to me," Jacob said, pulling Elena away from the windows. "I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, you climb that back wall and head for the caves. There's food and water cached up there, enough for several days. What about you?" "I'll follow when I can." Elena grabbed his arm with her good hand. "Jacob, don't lie to me. You're planning something that gets you killed." He looked into her dark eyes and saw his own truth reflected there. Somewhere in the past week, this woman had become more than just someone he was helping. She'd become someone worth dying for. "Maybe," he said honestly, "but I'm definitely planning something that keeps you alive." The sound of hoofbeats interrupted them. One of Marcus's men was riding closer, testing Jacob's defenses. Jacob sighted through his rifle scope and put a bullet in the dirt 2 feet in front of the horse's hooves. The animal reared, throwing its rider backward. "That's your only warning," Jacob shouted. Marcus's laughter echoed off the canyon walls. "You're outnumbered 7-1, friend. Those aren't good odds. I've faced worse. During the war, I imagine. Yes, I know about you, Captain Brennan. Decorated officer, fine service record. But the war's over, and this is my territory now." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Marcus had done his homework. "I know about your nightmares too," Marcus continued. "About the men you couldn't save. About the guilt that drove you to this God-forsaken canyon. Well, today you get to add 1 more failure to your collection." Elena's face blazed with anger. "Don't listen to him, Jacob. He's trying to get inside your head." But Marcus wasn't finished. "Did she tell you about the baby, Captain? About how she lost it because she was too weak to protect it? That's what happens to things Elena cares about. They die." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. Elena's face crumpled, and he realized Marcus had found the one weapon that could hurt her more than fists. "You're wrong," Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Elena's the strongest person I've ever met, and you're about to find out what happens to men who hurt people I care about." He turned to Elena, seeing tears streaming down her face. "That baby's death wasn't your fault. You know that, right?" Elena nodded, but Jacob could see the doubt in her eyes. Marcus had planted his poison well. "Get ready to climb," Jacob said. "This is about to get loud." He'd been saving one surprise for Marcus, a leftover from his war days. Hidden in the rocks above his cabin was a small cache of Union Army explosives, black powder charges he'd kept for clearing rock slides. Not much, but enough to change the odds. Jacob lit a long fuse and tossed the charge toward the canyon mouth. The explosion was smaller than Marcus's dynamite, but it brought down a wall of rock that blocked the main entrance. Suddenly, 7 men had become 4, with the other 3 trapped on the wrong side of a rock slide. "Now!" Jacob pushed Elena toward the back window. She climbed through, her broken arm making every movement agony. Jacob covered her retreat, putting bullets dangerously close to anyone who tried to get a clear shot at her. But as Elena reached the rock face and began her desperate climb, Jacob realized Marcus had one more surprise waiting. Billy appeared on the canyon rim above, having climbed up from the other side. He had a rifle trained on Elena's back as she struggled up the cliff face. "Stop right there, Mrs. Delacroix," Billy called down, "or I'll put a bullet in your spine." Elena froze, clinging to the rock wall 30 feet above the canyon floor. One slip, and she'd fall to her death. One shot from Billy, and she'd die anyway. Jacob found himself facing an impossible choice: save Elena from Billy, or defend against Marcus's remaining men who were already moving to surround his cabin. "Time's up, Captain," Marcus shouted. "My boy Billy has your woman in his sights. Throw down your weapons and we'll make this quick." But as Jacob raised his rifle, wondering if he could make the impossible shot that would save Elena, he heard something that changed everything. The sound of horses approaching fast from the south trail, horses that didn't belong to Marcus Delacroix. Sheriff Morrison's voice rang out like a cavalry charge as he and 4 deputies thundered into the canyon, their badges glinting in the morning sun. "Marcus Delacroix, you're under arrest for cattle rustling, fraud, and attempted murder." The tide of battle shifted in an instant. Billy, startled by the sheriff's arrival, swung his rifle away from Elena to face this new threat. Marcus's remaining men suddenly found themselves caught between Jacob's position and Morrison's deputies. But Marcus wasn't the type to surrender easily. "Sheriff," Marcus called out, his voice smooth as silk despite the chaos around him. "Thank God you're here. This madman has been holding my wife hostage. I was just trying to rescue her." Morrison's horse danced nervously as bullets began flying. "That's a creative story, Marcus, but I've got federal warrants that say otherwise." Elena clung to the cliff face, her broken arm screaming with pain. Below her, Jacob was pinned down by gunfire from 2 directions. Above her, Billy was arguing with himself about which target to shoot first. "This is insane," Billy muttered, sweat pouring down his young face. "Nobody told me there'd be law involved." "Shoot the woman," Marcus roared. "If we can't have her, nobody can." But Billy hesitated. Despite his eagerness to prove himself, he'd never actually killed anyone. The rifle trembled in his hands as he aimed at Elena's back. That hesitation saved Elena's life and cost Billy his own. Jacob's bullet took the young man in the chest, spinning him off the canyon rim. Billy's final shot went wild, chipping rock inches from Elena's head. "Elena!" Jacob shouted. "Keep climbing!" She forced herself to move, ignoring the pain in her arm, the burning in her lungs, the terror that made her hands shake. One handhold at a time, she pulled herself toward the caves Jacob had mentioned. Below, the gunfight had become a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks. Morrison and his deputies had superior numbers, but Marcus's men knew the terrain better. They'd scattered into defensive positions, turning the canyon into a maze of crossfire. Marcus himself had taken cover behind a boulder near the blocked entrance, his expensive clothes now dusty and torn. This wasn't how he'd planned things. His careful strategy was falling apart, and for the first time in years, he was losing control. "Thompson," he called to one of his men, "get around behind the cabin. We'll catch them in a crossfire." But Thompson was busy with his own problems. One of Morrison's deputies had him pinned down, and every time he tried to move, bullets sparked off the rocks around him. Jacob seized the moment. While Marcus was distracted, he slipped out the back of his cabin and began climbing the same route Elena had taken. His war-trained muscles carried him up the cliff face, faster than seemed possible. He reached Elena just as she collapsed onto a narrow ledge, her strength finally giving out. "I can't," she gasped. "My arm." "Yes, you can." Jacob pulled her to her feet. "The cave's right there. 20 more feet." Behind them, the gunfight was reaching its climax. Sheriff Morrison had worked his way close to Marcus's position, using skills learned in 20 years of dangerous work. "It's over, Marcus," Morrison called out. "Your boys are dead or running. Throw down your weapon." Marcus's answer was a bullet that came within inches of Morrison's head. "Have it your way," Morrison muttered, then whistled sharply. The sound was a signal. His 4 deputies moved in perfect coordination, surrounding Marcus's position from all sides. The cattle baron found himself staring down the barrels of 4 rifles with nowhere to run. "I surrender," Marcus said, raising his hands, but his eyes were scanning the cliff face, looking for Elena. He spotted her just as Jacob helped her into the cave entrance. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the way Jacob's arm wrapped protectively around her waist, the way she leaned into his strength. "You think you've won?" Marcus shouted up at them. "But I'll be out of jail in a month. I've got lawyers, connections, money, and when I get out, I'll find you both." Elena stepped to the edge of the cave, looking down at the man who'd made her life a nightmare for 8 years. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the canyon. "No, Marcus, you won't." She held up a leather pouch that Jacob recognized as his emergency money stash. But Elena wasn't looking at the money, she was looking at the papers folded inside it. "What are those?" Jacob asked. "Copies of Marcus's business records, proof of every illegal deal, every bribe, every crime he's committed in the past 10 years. Elena's smile was fierce. "I stole them the night I ran away." Down in the canyon, Marcus's face went white. "Elena, you don't understand what you're doing." "I understand perfectly. These papers are going to put you away for the rest of your life." Sheriff Morrison looked up at the cave entrance. "Ma'am, if you've got evidence of federal crimes, I need to see those documents." Elena looked at Jacob, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they began the careful climb down to the canyon floor. When they reached the bottom, Elena walked directly to Morrison and handed him the papers. The sheriff's eyebrows rose higher with each page he read. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said finally. "Marcus, you're not just going to jail, you're going to federal prison. These documents show enough crimes to put you away for 20 years. Marcus's carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. His men were dead, captured, or fled. His secrets were exposed. And the woman he thought he owned was standing free in the sunshine, no longer afraid of him. "This isn't over," Marcus snarled as Morrison's deputies cuffed him. "Yes," Elena said quietly, "it is." As they led Marcus away, he turned back one last time. "You'll never be rid of me, Elena. I'll haunt your dreams for the rest of your life." Elena watched him go, then turned to Jacob. "He's wrong about that too." "How can you be sure?" "Because I won't be sleeping alone anymore." The words hung in the desert air between them, full of promise and possibility. Around them, the canyon that had been a battleground was becoming peaceful again. The war was over, and for the first time in 8 years, Elena was truly free. But as Jacob took her hand, both of them knew their real story was just beginning. The letter that arrived 3 months later carried news that made Elena's hands shake as she read it by the kitchen window. Jacob looked up from repairing his damaged fence, concern creasing his features when he saw her face drain of color. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his hammer. "Marcus is dead." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "Killed in prison 2 weeks ago. They're saying it was a fight over gambling debts, but—" Jacob took the letter from her trembling fingers. The official prison correspondence was brief and formal, but between the lines lay a story of violence that had finally caught up with Marcus Delacroix. "But you think there's more to it?" Jacob finished. Elena walked to their small fireplace, staring into flames that reminded her of that terrible morning when Marcus had come for her. Men like Marcus don't just die in random prison fights. He had enemies, people whose lives he destroyed, whose families he ruined. Good riddance, Jacob said, though his voice was gentle. I should feel happy, free, but instead, Elena hugged herself, suddenly cold despite the warm spring air flowing through their open door. Instead, you feel guilty for being alive when he's not. Elena turned to look at him, surprised by his understanding. In the months since Marcus's arrest, she and Jacob had built something beautiful together. Their damaged cabin had become a real home, filled with laughter and quiet conversations, and the kind of peace Elena had never thought possible. But Marcus's shadow had never completely left. The town's talking, Elena said quietly. Mrs. Chen mentioned it yesterday when I was buying supplies. People are saying I'm a black widow, that death follows me wherever I go. Jacob's jaw tightened. What people? Does it matter? They're not entirely wrong, are they? My baby died. Marcus died. How long before something happens to you? Elena, look at me. Jacob crossed the room and took her shoulders gently. Marcus died because he was a violent man who made violent enemies. Your baby died because you were living in constant fear and stress. None of that was your fault. Wasn't it? Tears started flowing down her cheeks. Maybe if I'd been stronger, braver, if I'd left sooner. Stop. Jacob's voice was firm but loving. I won't let you blame yourself for things that were beyond your control. Elena pulled away from him, moving to the window that looked out over the canyon where their life together had begun. What if the people in town are right? What if I really am cursed? Then I guess I'll have to be careful around ladders and wild horses. Despite her pain, Elena smiled at his attempt at humor. This isn't funny, Jacob. No, it's not. But it's also not true. Jacob joined her at the window. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman who survived 8 years of hell and came out stronger. I see someone who risked everything to save evidence that put away a dangerous criminal. I see the person who turned this lonely canyon into a home. Elena leaned into his warmth, drawing comfort from his steady presence. And what if the curse is real? What if something happens to you because of me? Then at least I'll have had these months of happiness. That's more than a lot of people get. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light paint the canyon walls in shades of red and gold. Elena had learned to love this view, these quiet moments when the world felt safe and small. But their peace was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders were making their way up the narrow trail, Sheriff Morrison and 2 men Elena didn't recognize. Expecting company? Jacob asked, already reaching for his rifle. No. Elena's stomach clenched with familiar fear. Never again. Morrison dismounted near their porch, his face serious but not hostile. The 2 men with him were well-dressed, carrying saddlebags that looked heavy with documents. Sheriff, Jacob called out, what brings you up here? Official business, I'm afraid. Mrs. Delacroix, these gentlemen are lawyers from Santa Fe. They need to speak with you about your husband's estate. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Estate? The older lawyer stepped forward, removing his hat politely. Mrs. Delacroix, I'm James Patterson, representing the territorial court. Despite the circumstances of your marriage and your husband's subsequent criminal activities, you are still his legal widow. What does that mean? It means you inherit everything Marcus Delacroix owned that wasn't seized by the federal government for his crimes. Elena stared at the lawyer as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. I don't understand. The younger lawyer opened his saddlebag and pulled out a thick folder. Your late husband owned 3 cattle ranches, a silver mine, property in 4 different towns, and considerable cash holdings. After paying his debts and legal fees, the estate is still worth approximately $50,000. Jacob whistled low. $50,000 was more money than most people would see in several lifetimes. I don't want it, Elena said immediately. I don't want anything that belonged to Marcus. Ma'am, Patterson said gently, I understand your feelings, but legally, the property is yours. You can certainly dispose of it as you see fit, but first you have to claim it. Elena looked at Jacob, seeing her own confusion reflected in his eyes. Neither of them had expected this twist. What if I refuse the inheritance? Then it goes to Marcus's remaining relatives, specifically his cousin Robert Delacroix in Texas. Sheriff Morrison spoke up. "Ma'am, you should know that Robert Delacroix is cut from the same cloth as his cousin. If he gets that money and property, he'll use it the same way Marcus did, to hurt innocent people." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Take the inheritance, and she'd have to live with money earned through Marcus's crimes. Refuse it, and hand power to another man, just like him. "There's something else," the younger lawyer said. "Your husband left a sealed letter specifically for you. We're required by law to deliver it." He handed Elena a cream-colored envelope with her name written in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. Her hands shook as she took it. "Do I have to open it now?" "No, ma'am. Take your time to consider everything." As the lawyers prepared to leave, Patterson handed Elena a business card. "We'll need your decision within 30 days. After that, the estate goes to the next of kin automatically." After the men rode away, Elena and Jacob sat on their porch in stunned silence. The envelope lay on the small table between them like a coiled snake. "You don't have to read it," Jacob said finally. "Yes, I do." Elena picked up the letter with steady hands. "I need to know what final poison he left for me." She opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of expensive paper. Marcus's letter was brief, written in the formal language he'd always used when he wanted to sound important. But as Elena read, her expression changed from fear to confusion to something like wonder. "What does it say?" Jacob asked. Elena looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. But for the first time since the lawyer's arrival, she was smiling. "He's giving me a choice," she said. "Even from the grave, Marcus is trying to control me, but this time I get to choose how to respond." Elena's decision came to her in the middle of the night, 3 weeks after receiving Marcus's letter. She sat up in bed, startling Jacob awake, her face illuminated by moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. "I know what I'm going to do with the money," she announced. Jacob rubbed his eyes, trying to focus on her face in the dim light. "It's 3 in the morning, Elena. I'm going to build something Marcus would hate." Her voice was filled with quiet determination, something that undoes the damage he spent his life creating. Over breakfast, Elena spread out papers and maps across their kitchen table. She'd been making lists, drawing plans, calculating costs with the intensity of a general preparing for battle. "A school?" she said, pointing to her drawings. "Right here in Copper Ridge. A real school, with trained teachers, books, supplies, and not just for the wealthy children, for everyone." Jacob studied her sketches. Elena had drawn everything from the building's foundation to the arrangement of desks in each classroom. "This would cost thousands of dollars. I'll have 50,000, more than enough to build the school, hire teachers, and keep it running for years." "What about the rest of Marcus's properties?" Elena's smile was sharp with satisfaction. "I'm selling the ranches to the families who actually work the land. The miners can buy the silver mine they've been slaving in. Every piece of Marcus's empire gets broken up and given to the people he exploited." Jacob leaned back in his chair, amazed by the scope of her vision. "You've been planning this for weeks." "I've been planning this since I read his letter." Elena picked up the cream-colored paper that had tormented her for 3 weeks. "Do you want to know what Marcus wrote?" Jacob nodded. "He said he knew I'd inherit everything, and he hoped it would destroy me. He said the money was cursed, that it would turn me into someone as greedy and cruel as he was. He wanted his final gift to corrupt me. And instead, I'm using his own weapon against everything he stood for." Elena's eyes blazed with purpose. "Every dollar he earned through violence and fear is going to create something beautiful. Every property he used to control people is going to set them free." But transforming Marcus's legacy wasn't going to be simple. Over the following weeks, Elena discovered that dismantling an empire was almost as complicated as building one. The lawyers were helpful but cautious. Some of Marcus's business partners threatened lawsuits. Several territorial officials who'd taken bribes from Marcus tried to block the property sales. Most challenging of all was the town's reaction. "People are scared," Jacob reported after a trip to Copper Ridge for supplies. "They're not sure what to make of Marcus's widow suddenly becoming the richest person in 3 counties." Elena was sorting through Marcus's business records, documenting every crime, every bribe, every illegal deal. The evidence would go to federal investigators, ensuring that Marcus's criminal network couldn't simply find a new leader. "What are they saying?" she asked, without looking up from the papers. "Some think you planned Marcus's death to inherit his money. Others believe you're going to follow in his footsteps, use his methods to control the territory." Elena's pen paused over a particularly damning document. "And what do you think?" "I think they don't know you at all." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A woman Elena's age rode up to their canyon home alone, her fine clothes and expensive horse marking her as someone of importance. "Mrs. Delacroix?" The woman dismounted gracefully. "I'm Catherine Wells. I teach at the Territorial School in Phoenix." Elena came out to meet her, curious about this surprise visit. "Miss Wells, what brings you all this way?" "Your school?" Catherine's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Word is spreading about your plans. I wanted to offer my services as head teacher." Elena studied the woman's face, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the calluses on her hands that spoke of hard work. "What makes you think I need a head teacher?" "Because building a school is the easy part. Making it work, reaching children who've never had proper education, dealing with parents who think schooling is a waste of time, that's the real challenge." Over the next hour, Catherine explained her vision for education that went beyond simple reading and writing. She wanted to teach practical skills, critical thinking, and, most importantly, help children understand they could create their own futures. "It sounds expensive," Elena admitted. "Everything worthwhile is expensive. But consider the alternative. Another generation growing up without opportunities, vulnerable to men like your late husband." Elena felt something click into place. This was why she'd inherited Marcus's fortune, not as a curse, but as a tool for building something better. "When can you start?" Elena asked. Catherine smiled. "I already have." That evening, as Elena and Jacob sat on their porch watching the sunset, they talked about the changes coming to their quiet canyon life. "Are you ready for this?" Jacob asked. "Once you start spending Marcus's money, there's no going back to our simple life." Elena took his hand, feeling the calluses from his carpentry work, the strength that had protected her through the worst days of her life. "Jacob, do you remember what you told me the first day we met? You said helping me was the right thing to do." "I remember. This is the right thing to do. Marcus spent his life taking from people, controlling them, making them smaller. I'm going to spend his money making people bigger, giving them education, opportunity, hope." "And us? What happens to us when you become the most powerful person in the territory?" Elena turned to face him fully. "We become partners in something bigger than ourselves. We become the kind of people we never thought we could be." As if summoned by her words, Sheriff Morrison appeared on the trail below, riding hard. He dismounted quickly, his face grim with urgent news. "Elena, Jacob, we've got trouble. Robert Delacroix just arrived in Copper Ridge with a dozen men. He's claiming the inheritance is rightfully his, and he's prepared to take it by force." Elena felt her stomach drop. Marcus's cousin, the man she'd been warned about. What does he want? "Everything. The money, the properties, and—" Morrison hesitated. "And what?" "And you, Elena. He's claiming that as Marcus's widow, you belong to the Delacroix family now. Says it's his duty to control you the way Marcus did." Elena stood up slowly, feeling something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd thought the nightmare was over, but it was just beginning a new chapter. "How long do we have?" Jacob asked, already moving toward his rifle. "He's giving you until tomorrow at noon to surrender yourself and sign over the inheritance. If you don't." "If we don't?" Morrison's face was grim. "Then he'll come and take what he considers his by right, and he won't be as patient as Marcus was." Elena looked at Jacob, then at the canyon that had become their sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring another battle, another test of everything they'd built together. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for the future of every child who would attend her school, every family who would benefit from Marcus's broken empire. This time, she had something worth more than her own life to protect. The delegation that rode into Copper Ridge at 11:30 the next morning wasn't what Robert Delacroix had expected to face. Instead of a frightened woman ready to surrender, he found Elena standing in the town square surrounded by 40 armed citizens, Sheriff Morrison, and 3 federal marshals who'd arrived on the dawn train. "Robert Delacroix," called out Marshal Frank Davidson, his badge gleaming in the noon sun. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and threatening a federal witness." Robert sat his horse like a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. He was bigger than Marcus had been, with the kind of cruel smile that suggested he enjoyed other people's pain. His dozen men spread out behind him, hands resting on their weapons. "Marshal, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Robert said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of inherited wealth. "I'm here to collect my rightful inheritance and protect my family's interests. Your rightful inheritance was forfeited when you crossed state lines with armed men to threaten a witness in a federal investigation." Davidson replied, "Mrs. Delacroix has been cooperating with our investigation into your cousin's criminal network." Elena stepped forward, and Jacob could see the transformation that had taken place in her over the past 24 hours. Gone was any trace of the frightened woman he'd found by the creek. In her place stood someone who'd learned to wield power like a sword. "Hello, Robert," Elena said calmly. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Elena, darling." Robert's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "You've been playing with things beyond your understanding. Time to come home where you belong." "I am home." Robert's eyes flicked to Jacob, taking in the way he stood protectively near Elena, the rifle in his hands, the determination in his face. And who might this be? Another poor fool who thinks he can tame a Delacroix woman. "Jacob Brennan," Elena said with quiet pride. "My fiancé." The word hung in the air like a challenge. Jacob felt his heart skip. They'd talked about marriage, but Elena had never made such a public declaration before. Robert's face darkened. Marcus's wife doesn't get to choose her own husband. That's a family decision now. "Marcus's widow makes her own choices," Elena corrected. "And I choose Jacob." Marshal Davidson stepped between them. "This conversation is over. Delacroix, you and your men are under arrest. Drop your weapons." Robert's laugh was harsh as a crow's cry. "Marshal, I've got lawyers who'll have me out of jail before sunset, and federal connections that reach higher than you can imagine." "Maybe, but you'll be in jail when it happens." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 40 townspeople faced 12 armed men in the middle of Copper Ridge's dusty Main Street. Children watched from windows while their mothers pulled them back into the shadows. Then Elena did something that surprised everyone. She walked directly toward Robert's horse, stopping just within reach of his stirrups. Every gun in the square tracked her movement, but she moved with the calm confidence of someone who'd already won. "Robert," she said, looking up at him, "I have a proposition. I'm listening. Single combat. You against Jacob. Winner takes everything, the inheritance, the properties, and me." Jacob felt his blood freeze. "Elena, no." "It's the old way," Elena continued, ignoring Jacob's protest. "The way your family has always settled disputes. Honor combat instead of bloodshed in the streets." Robert's eyes gleamed with interest. He was bigger than Jacob, younger and probably faster. The odds would favor him in a fair fight. "What are the terms?" Robert asked. "Guns, knives, or fists. Your choice." "Elena," Jacob said urgently, "this is insane." She turned to him, and in her eyes he saw something that made him understand. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about taking control of her own story. "Trust me," she said quietly. Robert dismounted, his spurs jingling as he hit the ground. "Fists it is. When I beat your men unconscious, you'll come with me willingly. And when Jacob wins, you and your men leave the territory and never return. Deal?" Marshal Davidson looked unhappy. "Mrs. Delacroix, I can't allow this. These men are under arrest." "Marshal," Elena said respectfully, "with all due respect, this is a family matter, and sometimes family matters have to be settled the old-fashioned way." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "I'll referee. Fair fight. No weapons. No interference from either side's men." The crowd formed a circle in the street. Jacob stripped off his shirt, revealing the scars from his war service. Robert did the same, showing muscles built from a lifetime of violence. "Last chance to change your mind," Robert told Elena as he flexed his hands. "I never change my mind about important things." But as the two men faced each other in the circle, Elena's confidence was tested by Robert's sheer size and obvious experience. This wasn't going to be the quick victory she'd hoped for. The fight began with Robert charging like a bull, trying to use his weight advantage to overwhelm Jacob quickly. But Jacob had learned to fight during the war, against men who were trying to kill him. He sidestepped Robert's rush and landed a solid punch to the bigger man's ribs. Robert grunted but didn't slow down. His return punch caught Jacob in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around. The crowd gasped as Jacob stumbled. "Stay on your feet," Elena whispered, though Jacob couldn't hear her over the crowd's noise. Robert pressed his advantage, landing 2 more punches that opened a cut above Jacob's left eye. Blood streamed down his face, making it hard to see. But Jacob had advantages too. He was faster, smarter, and he was fighting for something more important than money or pride. Every punch he threw carried the weight of his love for Elena, his determination to protect the future they were building together. The tide turned when Robert made a mistake. Overconfident from his early success, he dropped his guard for a split second. Jacob's uppercut caught him flush on the chin, snapping his head back. Robert staggered, shaking his head to clear it. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "Getting tired, old man?" Jacob taunted, though he was breathing hard himself. Robert roared and charged again, but this time Jacob was ready. He used Robert's momentum against him, grabbing the bigger man's arm and throwing him over his hip. Robert hit the ground hard, dust exploding around him. The crowd cheered as Robert struggled to get up. He was hurt now, moving slower, his confidence cracking like ice in spring. But the fight wasn't over. As Jacob moved in to finish it, Robert pulled a hidden knife from his boot. The blade flashed in the sunlight as he lunged upward. Elena screamed a warning. Jacob twisted desperately, but the knife caught him along the ribs, opening a long gash that immediately began bleeding. "That's cheating," someone in the crowd yelled. Robert smiled through his split lip. All's fair in family business. But Jacob's war experience had taught him about knife fights too. As Robert raised the blade for another strike, Jacob grabbed his wrist and twisted. The knife went flying, landing in the dust 10 feet away. Now both men were bleeding, exhausted, fighting on pure determination. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing that the end was near. Robert threw one last desperate punch, putting all his remaining strength behind it. Jacob ducked under it and delivered his own final blow, a straight right hand that caught Robert perfectly on the point of his chin. Robert's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed like a felled tree. The crowd erupted in cheers. Marshal Davidson moved in quickly to secure Robert's unconscious form, while his men, seeing their leader defeated, surrendered without a fight. Elena ran to Jacob, tears streaming down her face as she saw his injuries. "You crazy fool," she said, touching his bleeding ribs gently. "You could have been killed." "Had to," Jacob gasped, still catching his breath. "Couldn't let him take you." "He was never going to take me. I had another plan." Jacob looked at her suspiciously. "What plan?" Elena's smile was mysterious. "I'll tell you later. Right now, we need to get you to the doctor." As the crowd dispersed and the marshals led Robert's men away in chains, Jacob realized something important had happened in that dusty street. Elena hadn't just been freed from the Delacroix family's control, she'd taken control of her own destiny. And somehow, in the process, she'd made him feel like he could do the same with his. The wedding bells of Copper Ridge's little white church rang out across the valley 6 months later, their joyful sound echoing off canyon walls that had witnessed so much violence and were now celebrating love. Elena stood at the altar in a dress of ivory silk, while Jacob waited beside her in his best black suit, both of them glowing with happiness that seemed to light up the entire building. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Matthews, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Brennan and Elena Delacroix in holy matrimony." Elena had insisted on keeping the Delacroix name for the ceremony, not out of any lingering loyalty to Marcus, but because she wanted to transform it from a symbol of fear into something associated with hope and healing. The congregation was a mixture of familiar faces and surprises. Sheriff Morrison sat in the front row with his wife, beaming like a proud father. Catherine Wells, now the head teacher of Elena's school, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Even Marshall Davidson had stayed in town for the celebration, his presence a reminder of how dramatically their lives had changed. But the biggest surprise was sitting in the third row, Robert Delacroix himself, flanked by 2 deputy marshals but no longer in chains. Elena had arranged his attendance as part of a plea bargain that had shocked everyone. Instead of 20 years in federal prison, Robert would serve 5 years and then spend the rest of his life managing charitable works funded by the former Delacroix fortune. It was the only way to break the cycle, Elena had explained to Jacob. Someone in that family needed to learn a different way to live. Whether Robert would truly change remained to be seen, but his presence at their wedding was a sign that even the most hardened hearts might be capable of transformation. Do you, Jacob Brennan, take Elena to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Jacob said, his voice strong and clear. He'd never been more certain of anything in his life. And do you, Elena Delacroix, take Jacob to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? Elena looked into Jacob's eyes, seeing reflected there all the healing they'd brought to each other's lives. I do. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Jacob had crafted himself in his workshop, Elena thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a broken woman fleeing through the desert, convinced she was cursed to bring death to everyone she loved. Now she stood surrounded by friends, about to marry a man who'd shown her what true love looked like, preparing to spend her life building something beautiful from the ashes of her past. By the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, tender, and full of promises for their future together. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the little church. As they walked back down the aisle together, Elena caught sight of something that made her heart soar. Through the open church doors, she could see the framework of their school rising on the hill overlooking town. Catherine had insisted on scheduling classes even while construction continued, teaching children under the shade of cottonwood trees until their proper classrooms were ready. The reception was held in the town square, with tables groaning under the weight of food prepared by every family in Copper Ridge. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with a 3-layer cake decorated with sugar flowers, while the local musicians provided dancing music that had couples swirling under the stars. As the evening progressed, Jacob found himself in conversation with Robert Delacroix, a surreal experience that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. You know, Robert said, his voice lacking the arrogance that had once defined him, I hated you for months after that fight. And now, Robert looked across the square to where Elena was laughing with a group of children from her school. Now I think you might be the luckiest man alive. I know I am. Take care of her, Brennan. She's stronger than any of us realized, but she's also more precious than Marcus ever understood. It was as close to an apology as Robert Delacroix was likely to offer, and Jacob accepted it with a nod. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests began heading home, Jacob and Elena slipped away from the crowd to walk through their new town. Everything looked different in the moonlight, softer, more hopeful, full of possibility. Happy? Jacob asked, taking her hand as they strolled past the school construction site. Happier than I ever thought possible, Elena replied. And scared. Scared of what? Elena stopped walking and turned to face him. Scared of how much I love you. Scared of how much happiness we've built. Scared that something might come along and destroy it all. Jacob cupped her face in his hands, feeling the smoothness of skin that had healed from Marcus's violence, seeing eyes that had learned to trust again. Elena Brennan, he said, testing out her new name. Do you remember what you told me the day we decided to fight Marcus together? Remind me. You said that sometimes saving one person is enough. Well, you saved me from a life of loneliness and regret, and I'm going to spend every day of our marriage making sure you know how grateful I am. Elena's eyes filled with happy tears. We saved each other. Yes, we did. As they walked back toward their canyon home, now expanded and improved, with rooms for the children they hoped to have someday, Elena realized that the curse she'd believed in for so long had been nothing more than fear wearing a disguise. The truth was simpler and more beautiful. Love didn't make you weak or cursed or dangerous to others. Real love made you stronger, braver, more capable of healing both yourself and the world around you. Behind them, Copper Ridge settled into peaceful sleep, while ahead of them stretched a lifetime of mornings to wake up together, challenges to face as partners, and dreams to build into reality. Elena had spent 8 years as Marcus Delacroix's prisoner. Now she would spend the rest of her life as Jacob Brennan's partner in creating something beautiful from the broken pieces of her past. And for the first time since she was 17 years old, Elena looked toward the future without fear, knowing that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The healing heart she'd discovered in a remote Arizona canyon had taught her the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting your enemies, but in choosing to trust that love can indeed conquer all.